Hi, Mark here. Welcome to another episode of On the Timeline, the series where we take a deep dive into the editing of our recent short films. This week, we're taking a look at our short film, Robots. Let's jump into Premiere Pro. So we start out over black and we hear the 56K dial-up modem start, and then we see this image of the street light and the telephone wires, and everything you do obviously should have a reason, and I wanted to set up straight away, almost abstractly, this theme of communication. The 56K dial-up tone is two modems communicating. We set up film. The use of film, which was set up to one side of the binary of film versus digital. So you can start to see in the first few moments, we're setting up things that we're going to carry throughout the film. When you plan things, it has to be very economical, especially in a short film. You want to set up from the get-go what elements you're using, how they're going to change and form throughout the narrative. Now, the thing about transitions like that, and with the film to the digital, it's obviously different types of cuts, more sort of creative transitions in a way. And you can think of them like fades, wipes, like Star Wars is classic for using like a ton of wipes all the time. But I think it's very difficult to make those types of cuts not feel like cheesy. Obviously in Star Wars it's these wipes, it's a big space opera. Cheese is awesome, it's baked in. But I think when you use creative transitions like this, if it's not in something commonplace like an advert or like another little maybe YouTube spot or something, you generally want to stay away from things like this, from using them too much. It may feel too trite, too contrived perhaps, but for this it was specifically planned. I was going to use the contrast between film and digital, so these transitions became very important. So from this opening shot here to when we see the two main characters here, Miranda and Kevin, I had originally planned as one long shot, one long unbroken take, because I wanted to sort of creep into this house and the camera is like a passive observer to the goings on inside this house party to draw you in. And after we did, I think it was like 8 or 9 takes of it, we were taking up too much time. So I went with the best take that we got, but then I went in and I did coverage of close-ups on the moments that I knew that I wanted to hold on. These very unspoken moments, following their eyes, introducing hands, connection, this breaching the line between that this wall is creating, and the cutting is starting to bring them together. Following the eyes in these cuts here, and these singles that I did. And then obviously we're focusing on eyes moving up. It's creating this sort of triangle between them as their hands start to connect and interweave connection. And then they pull together and we move counter to them. That is actually a cheeky cut. Cheeky hidden cut. Isn't that exciting? I wanted this to all be in sort of one-er, but that didn't work out. I had Cassia crossing frame at the end of this close-up here, and then I just matched it with the next shot, and it looks like one shot.
Please just answer.
And the end of this one take that we had to go and get the close-ups, as I said, ends up being the master shot for the beginning of the dialogue between the two characters. We jump in the middle of a conversation, and the blocking is very intentional. We have her in the background, him in the foreground, and still there's that line in between them there.
The question.
I didn't sign some dotted line. I'm allowed to change how I feel.
And I wanted to edit this almost like a tennis match. So
I'm allowed to change how I
that look there is what I'm looking for in a good performance, and Coquetto delivered this so well, and she throws it to him So it's almost like you can
I'm allowed
feel
to change how I feel.
that expression
I'm allowed to change how
almost
I feel.
hitting him.
I feel like
Those are those moments you're looking for in a good edit. Even if it's just a shot of two people talking, you can think of a dialogue scene as an action scene, but you need to focus on the subtle like glances and throws and punches and undercuts. So you can treat it like that when you're cutting it.
I need to code an app, you know? Like a Miranda feeling app or something that alerts me to every new thing you're suddenly feeling out of nowhere.
So you see here, I had his shot as he speaks, and he's saying this ridiculous thing that he needs to code an app, and she's like,
You know? Like a Miranda feeling app or something.
it's like, how are you rationalizing that? When you're cutting to a reaction shot, it doesn't even have to be the same take that was previously in at all. Even a take that might be considered bad as you shoot it might have like a really good reaction shot that you can use. We don't feel the impact of words in a scene in a film if we don't have a reaction shot. If the whole scene is just one character saying something and then we just hardly see what the other person is feeling about it, we don't know what the words mean because they're just hanging up there in the air. We need the reaction to pair the meaning of the words to and tether them to that meaning. That reaction is the actual meaning. The reaction shot, I believe, is even more important than the shot that precedes it, because that is where we derive meaning from the words that have just been spoken. This is very intentional in terms of the framing here. Kevin here, he's almost pushed up against the side of this frame, and there's all of this negative space behind him. And Koketsu here, Miranda, she has got all this space in front of her here. What I feel this does is Kevin's coming from, I feel like an ignorant place in terms of how he's rationalizing these things that he's saying, but she's sort of receiving it a bit more open here. So this framing feels a bit more confrontational, and it also feels a bit off because we're usually used to have the spacing being in front of the character. So just subtle things are there to give that sort of unconscious feeling to an audience here.
What was I supposed to get out of your never-ending let's spend the rest of our lives together bullshit?
It's not a dotted line. And I'm not an app. Are you like a sociopath or something?
A note about the dialogue here and where this whole short film came from is you can read it up on our blog. I was doing research into just screenwriting and dialogue. There's this sort of screenwriting rule, I suppose, or guideline, more like, that says that every new line of dialogue needs to introduce new information, otherwise it should be removed or it's not important. I was thinking that's absurd because so much of life, of an argument or even just a normal conversation is we say things in different words that mean the same thing, and often when we're arguing, we're saying the same thing over and over and over, and it's not introducing new information. There's a miscommunication. So how do you explore that in a film if apparently this dialogue sort of guideline or rule is you have to introduce new information every time? And then I started hearing these two characters in my head having this argument, and they were both essentially saying not much at all, but they're just throwing words back and forth at one another, clearly hinting at something underneath between their relationship. These two characters are very good at arguing with one another, and that's on purpose, is because their relationship needs to come to an end. And obviously, then what do you do when you're writing the story is that you need to find the counterpoint to that, and that is...
Are you like a sociopath or something?
new love. A note about these sequences, obviously filmed in slow-mo, it's hyper-real, which is another juxtaposition because the previous scene was regular motion, it's under this harsh lighting. I approached the dialogue scene and this scene differently when we shot it. I left these scenes, these shots that we took long, and I had cinematographer Louise have a sort of floating camera capturing these small intimate moments that I then interweaved, which is juxtaposed with this scene. So really think about how you approach a scene in terms of in pre-production and when you're shooting it, even when you're writing it. I do believe that screenwriters do need to know a lot about editing because it's a visual medium and editing is a bigger part of filmmaking in terms of how meaning is created. Another note about these scenes is if you see in the script here, I had some of the dialogue fight between Miranda and Kevin play over these scenes here, because I was thinking as I was writing it, oh, this is a nice way to juxtapose. I'll have the argument play over while I see this new couple start to have an unspoken moment. So there's the juxtaposition of the spoken with the unspoken moment. I edited it that way and it was just like way too much. Way too much. If you want something to be overstimulating, it needs to have the intention as to why it is overstimulating. Even something like Mad Max Fury Road, which is very like high octane energy, very huge and operatic, has those moments where it slows down and you really feel those moments, that ebb and flow. And that doesn't just mean cutting. It can just mean an overstimulation of information. And I felt that the dialogue argument playing over this as it was written in the script was just, you could not process what was going on.
I'm listening to what you mean with your words.
You're being ridiculous. Can you hear yourself speak? You see, I do listen.
So we see it gets more intense and at least I hope start to feel that they're almost like speaking in circles, you know what I mean? That it's this sort of endless cycle. As I said before, the other character comes in and it breaks that sort of back and forth. So we get that ebb and flow here and we introduce a new element.
Please get off the counter.
A note about this here, right? I had shot listed it out and I had a very clear vision of the blocking of the whole scene and where the characters would come in and how we would cover each shot and the screen direction. And when we did it in the space, Wenzel here, Kevin, and Kelton, who plays Jeff, and Coquetto, who plays Miranda, changed the blocking organically. I originally imagined him to just step off and stand where he was standing, but then he sort of moved across the room and the whole sort of dynamic shifted and became this triangle and she was stuck in the middle and she has this amazing reaction where it's kind of like, yeah, someone else is agreeing with me. That dynamic came out of having a plan, but then allowing the room to change. And what became interesting is the 180-degree rule, which is the rule that says that in terms of screen direction is that if you're going to have a shot and then a reaction shot, the character should be looking left to right, and then in the next shot they should be looking right to left. The camera is on an action line that is drawn between the two characters so that when we cut it, it looks like the characters are looking at one another. But this line changes as he moves around. There is a line drawn between Kevin and Jeff, and then there's a line between Miranda and Jeff and Miranda and Kevin, and we respect all of the screen direction and the eye lines of the characters that comes about through the shift. We're inside that triangle, and when there's three people in a scene, you can just be inside the triangle. And if you're shooting inside the triangle, if you think about it, all of the screen direction of all three characters will be respected. What I like about this part is if you notice him looking away,
Oh, of course. You've been
then
not-
she turns away. When characters are not looking at each other, it can also be as important as when characters are looking at each other, because we've established the eye line where they are in the geography of the scene. When they turn away, and then we cut to the other person to see their reaction to that behavior. Through the cut, we've then inferred in terms of what that look away means between the dynamic of the two characters. This sequence here and this sequence here obviously mirror one another, and the reason for this is because it adds to this sort of cyclical nature. If there was just one of these sequences, it would mean something entirely different, but because there's two, it creates the structure of this short film in terms of the characters that are repeating one another and arguing, and it adds to this sort of cyclical nature. The short film has a very considered structure, reinforces the intention of the piece. So another thing about this sequence is the transitions that I mentioned earlier. So if you look at this transition here, it blends together instead of having a harsh cut. I'm using this transition intentionally to bring them closer together, this sort of connection versus the disconnection of the couple fighting. What's very important is to set up a sort of grammar of the film that you're editing. You have to sort of teach an audience how this film is being cut so that you can break that intentionally. And this happens here towards the end of the piece. We set up this tennis match of back and forth, and then we haven't seen this type of camera move in the entire short film before. We haven't seen that type of cut in this short film at all, because there's that specific edit pattern set up to establish the grammar of the cutting of this specific short film that the audience becomes used to throughout watching the course of the film. When it is broken, it indicates that change in dynamic, that shift.
Well,
And we build up,
maybe I don't.
the bomb drops. Reaction, cut. And that's it for this episode of On the Timeline. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider subscribing. Maybe give it a like, share, all of those good things. We put out a new video every Tuesday and Friday with a new short film on the first Friday of every month. Thank you so much for watching. So, stay inside and make your movie.